With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, what we've all been waiting for here tonight. 8 years ago, VIEA had a vision to create an economic report card for the island that would be presented annually at the State of the Island Summit. Since the first report in 2015, how many years ago is that now? 2015, I might not have worn my glasses back then. The State of the Island Economic Report has become a model for other regions to follow. M&P has been proud to work with VIEA to bring this report to life each year, and our lead consultant on the project is our Senior Economist, Susan Mowbray. Having worked with a number of communities and industry groups on Vancouver Island and across the province, Susan has developed an in-depth knowledge of our regional economy. In fact, Susan has just returned from Kelowna, where she spoke at the very first Southern Interior Regional Economic Summit. And now she's here to share the highlights of the 2022 State of the Island Economic Report. Please join me in giving me a warm Island Good welcome to Susan Mowbray.
Okay, have a seat, Susan. Here's your clicker. Here's a microphone. For those that don't know, Susan and I have sat down and talked about this report for I think the last 3 or 4 years we've done this. Also, Susan knows my family very well. Used to work with my mom many years ago it was in the airline industry at Canadian Airlines.
That is true. Your
when
mother,
there wasn't Canadian Airlines.
when it wasn't Canadian Airlines, I believe your mother was my first boss.
My mom was your first boss?
One of my first bosses.
Oh, I
yes.
thought you were her boss.
No.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So we're going to do things a little bit differently for this presentation. James said it best. I think that if you come, I mean, you've all paid to be here. If you just sit and listen, there's not as much value as if you are engaged in this conversation. Every year, I like to try to get the audience involved, asking questions, and I'd like to do that this year. I know there were a few presentations where there wasn't enough time for questions. So the way, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way this is formatted this year is a little different from years past. In years past, Susan would give a beautiful, a terrific presentation, and then we'd open it up to questions. This year, we're not going to do that. This year, we're going to have sections. So we're going to discuss specific sections of the economy, and we're going to leave time for people to raise their hand and ask a question. And I believe we have 2 roaming mics in the audience. So if you have a question, when you hear something, you don't have to wait to the end. I'm sure some people had a question in earlier seminars and then forgot it because there was such a long space in between. But we will stop throughout this presentation and take questions from the audience. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right, let's start. Let's start with recovery, because I think that's the big focus of this year's presentation. We look back at past years, talking about pre-COVID, mid-COVID, in COVID, and here we are, and our economy is recovering. Let's start there. How are we doing in terms of recovery?
See, I think I'd rather talk than talking about recovery. I think we should be talking about where do we go from here.
Okay.
We heard a presentation, I think at lunchtime, that probably depressed a lot of people. That's why economists are called the dismal scientists. But I think that, to really think about why I don't want to talk about recovery, I need to show you some data, because I am an economist, and data is what it's all about, and it's about evidence. So if we start by looking at provincial GDP, what we see that is by the end of 2021, we were actually sort of in the range we were in 2019. So in that sense, we recovered. We had made up that lost ground. This year, the forecast is for growth to be somewhere between 3.6 and 4.2%. As we heard this morning, things are going to slow because of, we're putting the brakes on to tame inflation. But going forward, we're still expecting some modest growth. So to me, we've recovered. If I look at employment here on Vancouver Island, and this is not something you will see if you look at the data everywhere in Canada or even in British Columbia, but here on Vancouver Island, by the end of last year, employment was similar to what it was in 2019. And as of the first 7 months of this year, we're above where we were in 2019. So once again, we've recovered. Now, if we look at tourism, this is one of the sectors that was the hardest hit by the pandemic with all the restrictions. And here too, all indicators are up year over year, and we're approaching 2019 levels. We had cruise ships return to BC waters this year, and that was huge for places like Victoria. So once again, if you talk to Destination BC, they're not talking about recovery, they're talking about the future. If we look at population growth, I think we had some numbers up here earlier from some work that we had done earlier this year that showed that on Vancouver Island, we had between 2016 and 2021, we had the equivalent of the city of Nanaimo moved to the region. That continued during the pandemic. So we had really strong growth continue here on Vancouver Island over the pandemic. And we're still seeing growth as we move in to the post-pandemic period. It's not as strong, but we are still seeing people coming to Vancouver Island. So that trend, which has been a really important part of the growth story here, is continuing. If we look at business counts, what we've seen is that overall the number of businesses on Vancouver Island has been stable. We haven't lost a huge number of businesses. Once again, if you look at the Canadian numbers or you look at the BC numbers, business counts are down. But here on Vancouver Island, they've been relatively stable. The composition may have changed a little bit. We have lost some businesses, particularly in the hospitality and some tourism-related sectors, and they've been offset by gains in other areas. If we look at business formations, they're consistent with 3-year averages before the pandemic. So once again, I think we've recovered. If we look at bankruptcy trends, and this is one of those big puzzles, is why are we seeing reduced bankruptcy trends during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic? And as was talked about this morning, part of that is government supports. But we're not seeing significant increases in bankruptcies yet. On the consumer side, as interest rates rise, there is always a concern that that could cause some people to have to declare bankruptcy. But in 2018, there was a number of stress tests introduced on mortgages. And at this point, most mortgages would have gone through that stress test. So that's going to hopefully provide us with a little bit of buffer as interest rates rise. On the business side, there may be a slight increase in bankruptcies, but at this point, there's no indication, at least in the near term, that we're going to see an increase in bankruptcies. So overall, these indicators suggest to me that we're back to where we were in 2019.
Things have changed, though. I mean, we weren't talking about inflation a year ago or 2 years ago, and the labor market conditions have changed as well. Can we talk about sort of the changes, the specific changes from this time last year to today?
Well, I think anytime you go through a shock like we just went through with the pandemic, there's going to be significant changes to the economy. And, the question is, what is it that's normal? So what do we know that's changed as we go forward? The first thing is, all of a sudden, as we heard this morning, we're talking about a war in Europe for the first time since, in a long time, at least in most of our lifetimes. And this is disrupting energy markets, and combined with all that fiscal and monetary stimulus that was pumped into the economy, we're in an inflationary environment. Most of us have not really had to deal with inflation or think about inflation, and not having to think about inflation is kind of the way it's supposed to be, and that's what the Bank of Canada would like. Is it for us not to have to think about inflation? That's part of why they reacted so quickly, that as soon as it became clear that inflation was not transitory and was starting to become entrenched, we saw an immediate response from the central banks, and they've been very aggressive about dealing with that. And so, as Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve said, there's no easy way to tame inflation. We wish there was, but it's going to be painful. And so that's new. So that's definitely changed. It's something that businesses and consumers are going to have to deal with over the next, probably, hopefully, 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask, how long is this going to last? So you're thinking it's going to be a year and a half?
Anytime you have an interest rate rise, it takes 12 to 18 months, as we heard this morning, to work its way through the economy. It doesn't happen immediately. It takes time. We're starting to see signs that the economy is slowing, and it's having an effect. This morning, the Bank of Canada announced that the policy rate was going up by 50 basis points. We were expecting 75. So that tells us that they're seeing signs that, that they backed off a little bit on those brakes. but they're still going to continue until they're sure that it's under control. So hopefully by the early 2024, we'll be back in that 1 to 3% range. So that's one factor that we're looking at.
We are going to talk about specific industries, but I think this is a good opportunity. Does anybody have a question on anything we've heard right now? Yes, you, sir.
That is a really good, actually, I don't think that's something I can really speak to other than to say that our responses to deal with climate change will have impacts on our consumption patterns, and it will have impacts on other monetary indicators, but beyond that, I can't really speak to anything at this point.
Any other questions out there at the back? Do we have a microphone? We do. There's a microphone. So everyone can hear.
That's funny. So this may nullify my comment. I was going to say if you can please repeat the questions, but if the mic's going to come around, then forget that.
Okay. Perfect. The question was about climate change and inflation. Do you have any other questions before we dive into specific industries? Anybody? All right. Let's move in and talk about some island industries. Usually you break things down. Forestry, tourism, aquaculture. These are all big. Can we talk about how these industries are faring?
Well, let's talk first a little bit about this will kind of set the stage for that if we talk a little bit about the labor market.
Okay.
Because this is another thing that's changed a bit, and anyone who's a business owner and has tried to hire anybody in the last little while will understand what I'm talking about. So when I showed those numbers earlier, what came up was that employment is above where it was in 2019, which is a good news story. But if you dig a little deeper and start to look at the sectoral impacts, you see a slightly different story. It's not the case everywhere. And so, for example, if you look at accommodation and food services and hospitality, which was significantly hit, employment in that sector is still way below where it was in 2019. We see that manufacturing is down a little bit, and that reflects some of what's happening in our forest industry on it. Where we've seen growth in employment is in things that you can do remotely. We also have seen growth in healthcare and social assistance, but it's construction, it's things you can do remotely. It's not in sort of those industries that were necessarily hit the hardest by the pandemic. Then if we look at job vacancies, what you see is that the number of job vacancies on Vancouver Island is about 20, somewhere between 20 and 25,000. That's almost double what it was before the pandemic. And that means that these businesses, after weathering COVID, now all of a sudden they have to deal with a labor market where it's difficult to find people. And so how they're responding is we're seeing wage growth. And wage growth is actually fueling inflation. If you look at the inflation numbers, and I didn't see the inflation, I haven't had a chance to look at the inflation numbers that were released this morning, but in September, the Canadian inflation was going like this. Inflation in BC was going like this. And part of what was behind that is growth in the cost of services. And services are very labor intensive. And so as wages are increasing, that's increasing the cost of services. So that's something that businesses are having to deal with. So what's happening, and this is probably most readily apparent if you've gone to a restaurant or you've gone to a hotel, is that some of the services you would normally expect are not available. Or in a hotel, you may not get everyday cleaning. You may do virtual check-in. In a restaurant, a lot of restaurants are closing, some are working shorter hours. They may have closed early, or they may not be open every day. And that's a response to the labor shortage that we have on it. So we're also hearing more and more about sustainability and having to have an understanding of how we can build a sustainable economy, an inclusive economy.
You were saying before we came up here, we were talking about employment numbers and job openings, and you were saying that there's this really interesting thing happening. It's almost confusing because the two things are playing against each other. We've got employment's up across the board, but job openings are also up. Yeah. And it does those two things, you wouldn't think that they would be that way. So what's happening there?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a puzzle when you think about it, because why would we have way more jobs on Vancouver Island after we just went through this major shock? And so when you're looking at the aggregate numbers, it's not really clear, but we spent a lot of time talking to businesses and finding out what's going on. And A couple things are there is that there were certain sectors that really expanded during the pandemic. So we had a lot more online ordering, we had a lot more delivery. And so those companies hired a lot. And so that took people out of the labor force, and then there was a shift. We're also seeing that in response to the pandemic, there's a more willingness of people to call in sick from work. And that's a good thing from a public health perspective. But what it also means is that a lot of places need casual. You need to have more casual employees. So if I'm a trucking company and I need to make deliveries every day, I need to have a roster of casual people. So when you start to look into some of those job vacancies, you see that a lot of them are casual on-call positions.
But it says to me there's a lot more flexibility on the employer side, saying, look, we might not be able to get someone full-time, but if we can adapt the role, change it, be a bit more flexible on our end, maybe we can get people to fill those jobs.
Actually, they're having the hardest time filling those casual positions. And if you think about it from an employee perspective, why would I have a job where there's no guarantee in hours when I can go next door and have my guaranteed hours and have my flexibility? So what we're seeing in the labor market is the companies or the employers that are having challenges, the most challenges finding employers are those that aren't able to be flexible, are not willing to be flexible with their staff. Whereas employers that are flexible and adapting to the labor market have had more success in actually recruiting and retaining people.
Any questions on the labor market? I think my mic, it's back. There it is. Anybody have a question about the labor market hiring? Any employers out there that have a question about, we've got one in the back here. There we go.
Rory Kumala, Vancouver Island Construction Association. So when we're talking about labor solutions, we talk about immigration, we talk about untapped sources of labor such as women. What's the likelihood of that being reasonable to solve our problems?
So you're asking, is immigration likely to be able to am I correct there?
Well, it's great to say what we need, and the construction was in the red.
Yeah.
We know that. We talk about immigration being a solution, but the ability for our bureaucracy to accelerate and bring in the numbers to house them, to get them into the system, is it likely that that's going to be something we should rely on in the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think actually construction and any industry that employs a lot of skilled trades is a really interesting question. And one of the things with skilled trades is that a lot of the requirements vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So having someone come in from Europe to do a job as an electrician, they need to have their skills upgraded. There needs to be a pathway for them to be able to understand what the requirements are here, because the voltage is different there, and there are safety considerations. So I think and there are certainly some trials. We just did some work on the construction industry, and there's certainly some experimentation going on with how can you get skilled tradespeople from other jurisdictions to come into BC and be able to meet the requirements we have here. The other thing within the construction industry is technology. If you look at productivity numbers in construction, they're flat. They've been flat for the last 20 or 30 years. And that's an indication that technology hasn't been adopted to the same degree it has in other areas. So we're starting to see more experimentation with technology. So for example, in residential construction, you're starting to see modularization. So rather than site-built homes, you have factories where the house is being built in the factory and it's assembled on site. It's coming out of the factory with the walls plumbed and all the electrical. It just has to be put together. And it's getting to the point that technology is getting to the point where you can actually have a custom-built home that way. It's not like a cookie cutter. So there's companies in the prairies that are doing this. So that's one solution, is the adoption of technology and the use of technology. I think we also have to recognize that skilled trades are, they're an important part of what we are. And if you look at the PNP program, what you see is that if I'm an accountant and if I have I'm entering as an accountant working in downtown Vancouver, I get this, I'm actually rated higher than a skilled tradesperson working in a remote community. The way the points work, and I understand why they do the points the way that they do, because you only have a certain number of immigration, but there's certain questions about whether that makes the most sense. There's also got to be more work done on attracting people to the trades and making them understand that these aren't the trades that we think they are. When you think about an auto mechanic, it's a tech job. You have to be able to program a car. It's pretty cool, some of the technology. So I think there's things like that that need to be considered to help fill our labor gaps, about more understanding of what the future skills are in these occupations, and more work by the the representatives from the different associations to market that, if I'm working as a crane operator, it's kind of like, it's kind of, you're using a joystick and you're doing things. It's kind of like playing Minecraft all day. Sounds like a good job to me. I know my son would love it.
I couldn't do it. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you for the question, by the way. We've got another question here about the labor market before we move on. We've got another one over here.
So my name's Mike Gagan. So one of the issues we have is that we have young people giving up on the idea of having families because they can't afford to rent, let alone buy family housing. A society where our children can't afford to have families of their own when they grow up is a society without a future. We have to get serious on all levels of government. Federal and provincial governments need to start freeing up Crown land for housing, and the provincial government needs to take back its authority and have a provincial housing authority which will overrule the plethora of NIMBY local governments that we have in this province and in this country.
Michael, we are going to talk about housing. I know that's in the report. Is there a question there before we move on?
So the question is when we're looking at economic growth and all these factors, are we factoring in things that we now have working people living in RVs because they can't find affordable housing? And are we factoring in the societal damage we're doing when it's not just the drug addict and the alcoholic and those with schizophrenia living on the streets, but we're starting to see working people living on the streets? What are we doing with the tremendous economic and societal damage about that? And are we applying the kind of pressure we need to all three levels of government so that we can actually start functioning as a society again?
I'll let you respond. I mean, we did have a great seminar with Minister Malcolmson, the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, where we addressed some of those questions, Michael, but do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so that's certainly something that the issue of housing is something that is going to constrain growth. And as Joe said, we're going to talk a little bit about what we found when we looked at the state of housing on Vancouver Island. It is definitely an issue for working people to be able to find housing.
Let's get one more or two more questions in here on labor. If we can focus on labor, and then we will move on to some of the other areas of this report. Sir.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for all of this. I just want to kind of pose a couple of comments and then a question. I think we're facing a perfect storm with respect to pressures on some of these matters, societal changes, technology disruption. But what I'd like to get your comments on are the fundamental demographic shifts that a fellow by the name of David Foote, who wrote a book called Boom, Bust, and Echo, predicted many, many years ago. So that's part of the perfect storm. And those fundamental demographic shifts are occurring while all of these other things are occurring. And we seem to have kind of lost track of simply demographics. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, this is certainly something that is part of why we're seeing these big job vacancy rates. Is we did see a lot of people exit the labor market during the pandemic. There was a lot of early exits. Some of those happened in the skilled trades, just because of everything that was going on. And so that's definitely a factor. The federal government has actually increased the number of immigrants. They've just announced higher immigration targets going forward. So that's part of the potential solution for that. But going forward, we need to think about how we use our resources differently. And it's really about investment in technology to address some of these labor shortages and make up for that demographic deficit. So for example, there are ways that you can deliver services electronically. For small businesses, they may not be aware of those, and they may need help investing in those. If you look at a restaurant, there's no, they're having trouble finding servers. You can implement technology so that people can order virtually, like they can do it from their phone just with a QR code, and that reduces the number of staff you need in it, so you can reduce the number of servers. So the solution to this is likely in the form of technological adoption in some form or another.
Let's get one more question, and then we will go back and let you get back to your slides. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Thank you. First of all, Andy Adams from Campbell River. And Susan, I just, after coming to VIEA for years, I've always looked forward to your presentations on the state of the economy for Vancouver Island. So for that, I want to thank you for a great job. Very interesting. Always look forward to it. Graham kind of touched on what I was going to talk about, and that is the amount of people that have left the workforce early because, we've gone through 3 years of COVID. People have just said, I'm close to retirement. I'm going to step out now. I know Rory would like a bunch of those people back to fill some of the vacancies that he's got. With the projections that you're seeing with the inflation and the state of the economy going forward, do you envision that in addition to what you're talking about the technological advances that will help fill some of those labor gaps, that you'll have that workforce that stepped out early may return on a part-time or semi-part-time or fill that void that is desperately needed for particularly small businesses that are having trouble keeping the doors open for a full day shift? Thank you.
Yeah. Andy, that's a great point, and it is actually something that there's not a lot of data on it yet, but there is some anecdotal evidence that some people who retired have started to return to the workforce. And we know, based on past experience, that returns for retirement savings are not going to do well based on the forecasts over the next period. So there is a good chance that some people will return to the workforce in a part-time basis, or maybe on a full-time basis, just because with the returns on their portfolio and the fact that inflation is eating away at their purchasing power, it will provide incentive for some people. So that's definitely a potential a potential short term, but that's not going to solve our problem long term, because this is a long-term issue with the labor market.
Thank you for the question, Andy. We'll let you get back to your slides and take us where you want to take us next.
All right. So I think we were talking about industries.
Yes.
You wanted to know a little bit about what was happening with Vancouver Island's key industries. So we'll start with forestry. And, I think for forestry, we before the pandemic, we were seeing the industry go through modest declines, and the continuing modest declines in response to things like fiber supply and so on. And that has continued. We did see an improvement in 2021, and in the first part of 2022, things were down again. And this is partly because at the start of the year, we had some poor weather that made it difficult to do harvesting, but we're also seeing weakening market conditions, and that's expected to lead to slowdowns. So we've also, we've been seeing reductions in shipments through the ports, and the effect of those weakening markets are very evident when a couple of weeks ago we saw that Crofton shut down their paper operations indefinitely, and it's not clear what's going to happen with pulp operations at this point. So that we can expect a little bit more of that going forward. We also have the question of what's going to happen with old growth deferrals. Of the 11 areas that are part of the old growth deferrals, 5 of them are here on Vancouver Island. I think we're cautiously optimistic that there'll be a solution to those that'll be positive for the industry. But at this point, it is creating a lot of uncertainty. Another industry with a lot of uncertainty is aquaculture. Production has been pretty stable, but we did see a lot of supply chain disruptions that affected costs for the industry and access to markets through the pandemic. And we're still we did see some progress this year in terms of resolving what's going to happen to salmon farming. And, there's still a lot of uncertainty that it's affecting investment levels in the industry. We just had numbers. We haven't had numbers for about 5 years on what's happened to agriculture on Vancouver Island. And what we actually have seen is declines in the number of farms in our agriculture industry. And what's driving that is the cost of land. So the rising cost of real estate has led to some consolidation. And we've also seen that aging demographic where farmers are not, their kids don't want to take over the farm, and so they're leaving the industry. So that's led to a decline. Most of the decline in farm counts has occurred in the Nanaimo area and the Cowichan Valley. So about 40% of overall declines are there. And whereas, capital's been relatively stable, the capital region, and then other areas is sort of about 3 to 10%. One thing that's really interesting about looking at the agriculture numbers, and it kind of highlights that we don't have a full picture of anything at this point, because as I said earlier, we always know that when we go through a shock, there's a structural change to the economy, but the way we measure the economy is from like 30 years ago. So we don't have a full picture on everything. So these agriculture numbers, we have a growing, seaweed farming industry on Vancouver Island, and those aren't captured here. So it looks like farming's going down, but Cascadia seaweed is not included in there, and that has huge potential on it. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we're looking at the numbers. We're only looking at a partial picture here.
There are people that work in these industries in this room right now, so maybe I'll just stop you there. We
Yep.
talked about forestry and aquaculture and agriculture. Is there anybody that works in one of these industries that would like to chime in here and ask Susan a question pertaining to your line of work? We can keep going. We'll keep going. Let's keep going.
Let's keep going. Okay. The other thing about the decline in farm counts, and I'd be curious to know if there's anyone in this industry or in this room that can answer this, is we saw that most of the decline, that the biggest declines were in animal production, and it was about horses. And so the question is it during the pandemic, is it because everything froze in sort of the equine industry? Is that why we're seeing a decline in horse farms, or is this part of a longer term trend? So it's a bit of a puzzle. It happened right across BC, but
Do you have any idea why?
No.
Oh,
Like I said, I'm curious if it's a pandemic thing or this is part of a longer term trend.
I do happen to know the answer to this question. The decline you're seeing in horse farming is is cost of feed primarily.
Is it?
Particularly on the island, hay costs are probably at least double what they were last year. And the horse market has been, like everything else, hit by inflation. So we're paying a lot more for not as nice horses. And it's yet to kind of settle out. A lot of people who didn't go on vacation bought nice horses. So there's a lack of inventory and costs are way up. So a lot of people who were doing it have gotten out.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Thank
There's
you.
your answer.
There's my answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So agriculture, I know we're going to get into education, yes, and then
Yeah.
tourism.
Yes, education and then tourism. So international education is really important for Vancouver Island. It's it's part of a plan to sort of bring people here, part of that immigration plan to get people educated and part of our labor force. So we did see an increase in students year over year, and a big rebound as our post-secondary institutes started to offer in-person classes. However, we didn't see an increase. We didn't see the same trend in students from China. And I think I've said many times before, China is a really important market for BC. A lot of our international students do come from China. And the reason we're not seeing as many students from China, there's a couple of reasons. The first one is that the quality of Chinese universities has improved. And so the incentive to go to school in a Western university is not quite what it once was, given the costs. There's also still COVID restrictions, as we heard this morning, in China on travel. And finally, our relations with China have been deteriorating. So we're seeing sort of declines on that side. And it's not clear that we're going to see a significant rebound in the number of students from China anytime soon.
I think there's labor restrictions too. Many students can't work X number of hours, and I think there's big pushback right now to have international students be able to work full time.
Yeah, right now students
Isn't
can
it
work, I believe,
20
20.
hours?
It's
Yeah.
20 hours.
Yeah.
You can work 20 hours while you're studying.
And they want to be
I
able
think
to
it
work
might be
more.
full-time on campus.
Is it on campus full
It
time?
might be full-time, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Tourism.
And then finally, there's tourism. I did talk a little bit about tourism earlier, but in terms of the overall performance, it's important to understand that even though we saw visitor numbers come back, that was mostly domestic and US visitors. The international market's not back. The air capacity is not back to IVR yet. They're hoping it'll be back by sometime next year, but we're not seeing the same volume of international travel. And usually that market is like you're booking sort of 4 to 6 months out. And when we lifted all of our travel restrictions, it was too late for the summer season internationally. So that combined with the capacity meant we didn't see a lot of international visitors. The other thing is a lot of those businesses, as I sort of talked a little bit about, are operating at below capacity, and that includes the cruise ships. So in the summer, we had a record number of cruise ships expected to go to Victoria, but those cruise ships were not operating at full capacity. They were only accepting about 2/3 of the bookings so that they could offer social distancing, and if they had to quarantine, that space would be available. So even though we're seeing those things come back, it's not to the same level it was before. So I would say that for a lot of those businesses, they're still struggling. They're not seeing the same kind of revenues that they had before.
And does your data tell you where people are coming from? Were you able to break that down at all?
Mostly it would be domestic in the US. Okay. Is what it is.
Okay.
So.
Any questions about tourism? It's Mike, tourism, anything you just heard there? Any questions for Susan about specific industries before we move on to, I believe we're going to talk about housing next, but yes, from the center of the room.
Just wondered about the effect of the ArriveCan app on our visitors this summer.
I think the ArriveCan app probably did have a bit of a negative effect. I think the bigger effect, though, was on that lack of capacity, of air capacity, and the cost. So one of the things we're seeing right now is the cost of travel is going up a lot. So if you noticed, if you went anywhere, it was a lot more expensive to fly somewhere. Hotels are a lot more expensive too. And that's, that has the risk in some markets of making us think about, is the value proposition there going forward? So I think that was the bigger impact as opposed to the ArriveCan app.
Any other questions from the room? All right, let's keep this moving and dive into the topic of housing.
We could probably spend all night talking about housing. So what we did is we looked about 6 months ago, we started looking at some data. We wanted to sort of see what the long-term trends had been on Vancouver Island while we were preparing the report, and then we released a series of sort of snippets. And so one of the things we looked at to start with, to sort of understand what was happening in the housing market, was the question of what's happening with incomes. And so when we looked at what's happening with income, so this is the data that we had shows the change in median household income between 2015 and 2020. And so what we see is that there's an increase in income. So incomes for single person households on Vancouver Island have been rising over that period by about 11 to 15%, which is, good. It was in line with inflation. That's a good thing. And over the same period, if we look at, larger households, we're seeing similar trends where it's going up between 6 and 15%. So incomes are rising. The other interesting piece is that the percentage of persons in low income is falling, which means people are, should be, from a well-being perspective, doing better. We've put up the 2015, 2019, and 2020 numbers because it's important to distinguish that in 2020, some of those declines could be related to COVID support. So we saw really big percentage point changes between 2019 and 2020. How big those numbers are, we'll see when the 2021 data comes out as those COVID supports pull back. But regardless, before that, we were seeing improvements in this measure. So that was all very positive. But when we looked at housing, and this will kind of come back to answering your question, over that same period where we saw that 11 to 15% increase in incomes, we were seeing rent go up by 40 to 60%. Housing prices more than doubled. So it was costing people a lot more for housing. The other thing about this is that if you look at what happened, we've heard about this pullback in the housing market, but we're still seeing prices go up on Vancouver Island. So as of June, prices were still up year over year. This is before those interest rates really had an effect, and we've seen a little bit of a price correction, but we're not talking pre-pandemic price corrections. We're talking a couple percentage points overall.
So let's talk about this. What is driving that? Can you tell us? I mean, in terms of rent going up 40 to 60%, and at the same time, the slide before, we've got fewer people on lower incomes, yet the prices are just going through the roof.
We have more people than we have housing. And if you look at the growth in the number of people on Vancouver Island and you compare it to the growth in the housing stock, the number of people on Vancouver Island has outpaced the growth of that housing stock. So we need to be able to provide more housing. And as I'm not sure the gentleman over here, Michael pointed out, working people can't find housing. Like we've heard numerous reports of people who have wanted to come to Vancouver Island who actually haven't been able to come to Vancouver Island because they can't find housing.
And the challenge is housing takes a long time to build. So what's the expectation here? Is this going to get worse? Are prices going to continue to go up?
So we're in an environment where we're seeing interest rates rise and construction slow. That is not a recipe for fixing this problem at this point. I know the government's making significant investments, but we need to do something about housing. This is not just a Victoria problem, it's everywhere. It's not just a Vancouver Island problem, it's right across the province. And it's especially hitting smaller communities where there's fewer housing options to start with.
So the solution is more housing quicker. Faster.
More housing faster, which is easy to say, hard to do.
Questions? Does somebody want to jump in here? Yeah, I figured there'd be a few. We'll go to this gentleman right in the center of the room here, if we can grab him a microphone, and then we'll get you in the back, sir, after that. Right here, this gentleman standing up, sorry, the one waving his hand. Thank you.
So my name is Kim Burden, I'm from Parksville, and I think that we need to encourage government to play a role by reducing the impacts of the Residential Tenancy Act on investment in rental accommodation. To see the economy go up by more than 7% over the last several years, and to see a freeze on rents and then a whopping great 2% increase this year is really a detriment to people investing in rental housing, which is what we need more than anything to help our workforce.
Good comment. I'm not sure there was a question in there. Do you care to comment on that?
I'll just leave it as a comment.
You'll leave it as is, okay. Back of the room, we've got another question.
My question is, how come we only got half the island? Does the island stop at Campbell River?
I'm going to ask Poe about that one. I missed that.
It's a good question, sir. It's a very good question.
This is the second slide that you've shown that ends in Campbell River.
It ends at Mount Waddington is there, it's just not outlined on it. Sorry, I missed that when we proofed these.
All right, is there another question on housing? I think I saw a hand over here. Over here, yes, at the front. Thank you to our volunteer. It's all right.
Getting my offer.
Yeah.
I hate taking two questions, but I have to. And this is a bit of a comment, and I'm going to try to weave in a question here. But housing and the housing needs, you know, obviously they're important here, and the whole kind of island thing that, you know, do we have 2 islands or 3 islands? I'm not quite sure about that, but I'm going to put an honored colleague on the spot here a little bit. Dr. Alan Winter was the first BC Innovation Commissioner, and Alan took some time with me to tour around some of the companies that are doing some cool things. And there's a company in Qualicum Beach called Cloudhead Games. They are in the elite class of virtual reality development, et cetera, et cetera. And Alan came to their studio and sat down with the CEO of the company, and I know these folks well, so they wouldn't mind me saying this. And Alan said, you know, if I had a magic wand, or if I could ask you what you would like to progress your company, what do you need? What could government provide? What would it be? And I kind of paused because I kind of pictured what Alan might have wanted to hear was, how about an innovation center or a cluster or more venture capital or something like that? And then he said, well, housing. And so some of you might know this company, but this company is bringing talent from around the world, and they can't house the folks that are trying to come here. And then he also said that we have this amazing studio, and not one of us can ride our bicycles to our office, right? So these are poignant, difficult issues. And I guess that is actually more of a comment, but it's food for thought.
No, but I'm sure that's something that you hear talking to people and employers, is that they want to bring people on, but there's nowhere for them to live. I mean, that's something we've heard in Victoria for a long time now. Every sector, I mean, needs workers, but there's no place to house them.
There's no place to house them, and it's something that it's not an easy, there's not an easy solution. We need to build more housing.
So what if we don't build more housing, what happens? Do the prices continue to rise? What does the fallout from that look like?
If we don't address the housing problem, you're going to really have a significant impact on growth because people can't afford to live here. And so you're not going to be able to go to a restaurant. You're not going to be able to go to, your services are going to disappear. And it's not going to, growth will be constrained. But we need to figure out how to build more housing for people.
And I know the comments aren't questions, but I know that I think there's some frustration there. And you're a chief economist, not a government official, so I'm sure you do get a lot of questions that you can't answer.
It's about supply.
Yeah.
This is simple supply and demand. It's like this, supply is less than demand, prices go up.
Yeah. I'm just looking at my watch here. Do we have a few more slides to go on housing, or can we move on? Okay, let's talk about recessions and possible recessions. It's something that came up earlier. I think that Stuart said that we might be heading towards a global recession. What did he say? He said we might bypass it, but it's a possibility, something along those lines. Here on Vancouver Island, we want to focus locally. Your thoughts, are we heading towards any type of recession?
I think I'd use the word slowing of the economy. Recession is a technical term, and there's all sorts of different definitions of a recession. So this morning, Stuart was talking about a technical recession, and that's when the numbers show that you have a decline in growth for 2 quarters in a row, or depending, it might be at the global level. I believe the IMF uses less than 3% global growth. Growth is considered a recession. But really, it's about, I think from everyday people, for them, a recession is about what happened to my income, what happened to my job. And right now, we have a shortage of labor. And so I think we're going to see slowing economic growth, and we'll probably see an adjustment in the labor market to bring those two things into line. And so rather than a recession, I'd say we're going into a period of sort of slower, weaker growth.
And any idea timeline? Will it be a year, 2 years?
I would typically these things take about 18 months historically, but we don't know how long it's going to take to come out of our inflationary cycle this time, or what's going to happen in the Ukraine.
Yeah, as people open up the report, they will see there are a few new things in the report this year, and I'd like to highlight what's new. Can you go over some of those items?
Yeah, so one of the things that as we've emerged from the pandemic, and this is something, so every year when we do the report, we start with the report committee, and it's comprised of a number of people. And one of the things we're looking for is how can we fill gaps in the data, in the existing data. And from the very beginning, there were 2 gaps in the data that was available that we felt were kind of glaring. One was around sustainability, and one was the contribution of Indigenous peoples. And so we've tried to address those over the last few years. There's been some data come out that we've been able to use. So this year you'll find some information on sustainability and sustainable growth in Vancouver Island. It's not great. It's very limited, and we do talk a little bit about that, but it's a start. We're also able to put in some information on the Indigenous footprint, the Indigenous economy on Vancouver Island. Once again, there's some significant gaps in it, but it's a start and sort of giving us that baseline of where we're starting from as we move towards reconciliation.
And something that will be included in future reports as well.
We'll do our best.
Yeah, great.
As long as the data is available.
Great. Any final questions as we wrap up here before we say thank you to Susan for her time and her effort on this? Any questions on anything that you heard today? We've got one in the front here.
This is just in relation to the housing thing. That this handsome man just moved on to the next topic. I just want to know that do you have any data with respect to how much the provincial government is investing in housing, in dollars vis-a-vis the private sector altogether?
That data, there is some data available. I don't have that handy, but there is investments. There's significant investments being made in housing, both federally and provincially, and there's also investments being made on this on the private side. But I don't have those numbers.
Or just to gauge how much the government is interested in creating more and more houses with respect to the private investors, because I believe the private investors, they have always interest in getting the returns, whereas government's mandate is to make sure that people get what they want. Yeah, just for that purpose. Thank you.
Over here, anybody? I'm not seeing any hands. So perhaps as we wrap this up, maybe a parting comment to people in the room. If you had to sum up this year's report, everyone's going to dive into it. We've sort of scratched the surface there. But what is your message? If you could put it into just a tight, concise summary of what you saw over the last year.
So what I would say is, based on what we saw over the last year and trends going forward, that Vancouver Island will continue to outperform other parts of the country. But when we talk about outperforming, we're talking about a slowing growth period.
Everybody's slowing down.
Everyone's slowing down, but Vancouver Island and BC are sort of expected to continue to outperform.
You were just in the interior giving a talk just like this one. Challenge was much different.
Yep. I think you're in better shape than parts of the interior, for sure.
Right. All right. Any final questions before we go? I think that's it. All right. I'm going to bring Pip White up to say a few words on behalf of the committee chair, and then we will wrap this up. So Pip White.
Always the test. This for me is always the highlight of the evening. I'm an economist. I've had the pleasure of chairing this committee for the last 4 years. I think I've been on it for 6. It's an interesting debate as we try and put it together, and what are we going to talk about qualitatively, because we don't have data. I'm really happy that we've at least started with the Indigenous business contribution to the economy. It's a really important sector. If you haven't read Carol Ann Hilton's book, you should. And I'm very happy to have been working with Susan, because this is my last year doing this.
I just want to say thank you to Pip. He's always been such a supporter for this and always made such a huge contribution. You will be missed.
Thank you, Pip. And one last round of applause for Susan. Thank you, Susan. Folks, that concludes day one. Breakfast tomorrow is at 7:30 a.m. Say that again, Mayor Crow. $20, correct? Yes, you can order a copy of the report. I believe some people received a digital copy as well. Everybody gets a digital copy, but you can get a hard copy for $20. Thank you, Mayor. Breakfast, 7:30 tomorrow morning. If you arrive at 8, you take your chances. Breakfast might be there or might not. Thank you for coming on behalf of all of the sponsors. Thanks for being here. That concludes day one.